Honestly, it's sort of an inevitable part of the discussion. With the advancement of technologies, it stands to reason that games would look better over time, but does that really make them better products? Video games can't afford to look this good. The gaming industry spent billions pursuing the idea that customers wanted realistic graphics. Did executives misread the market? Insomniac Games, which is owned by Sony, spent about $300 million to develop Spider-Man 2, according to leaked documents, more than triple the budget of the first game in the series, which was released 5 years earlier. Chasing Hollywood realism requires Hollywood budgets, and even though Spider-Man 2 sold more than 11 million copies, several members of Insomniac lost their job when Sony announced 900 layoffs in February. Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Hard Light Network. Guys, honest question for the hardcore gamers out there. Was photorealism a mistake? When we look back at the course of gaming through the last decades, has improving the graphical fidelity of these titles actually improved the overall quality of games as a whole? Speaking from personal experience, growing up throughout the decades with these consoles, the move from generation to generation was almost always haunted by the same sentiment. Bro, just look at those graphics. Honestly, it's sort of an inevitable part of the discussion. With the advancement of technologies, it stands to reason that games would look better over time, but does that really make them better products? Obviously, you don't want your games to look like crap, but how much really does the success of a game depend on 4K, Ultra HD, high-quality texture packs, fully implemented ambient occlusion, ray tracing, and particle physics? Do I really need to see a unique cloud of condensation come from a character's lips when they're breathing cold air? How much value does seeing every individual butt hair on Kratos really add to the experience of God of War? As time goes on, I'm less concerned about the improvement of graphical fidelity, especially as it seems like we're starting to hit a ceiling of sorts. But of course, before we get into it today, guys, you know I have to ask you to hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the content that I've got coming up for you in the future, and hit that comment section down below with your thoughts on the ever-expanding graphical capabilities of AAA titles. Your help goes a long way in helping to spread these videos through the algorithm and bring the latest in gaming news and topics to other gamers like yourself. Also, if you wanted to go that extra mile, there is a super thanks option down below. Without any further ado, however, let's get into today's article. And of course, today's video comes to us from New York Times and is entitled, "Video Games Can't Afford to Look This Good." The gaming industry spent billions pursuing the idea that customers wanted realistic graphics. Did executives misread the market? And the article begins as follows. One way to understand the video game industry's current crisis is by looking closely at Spider-Man's spandex. For decades, companies like Sony and Microsoft bet that realistic graphics were the key to attracting bigger audiences. By investing in technology, they have elevated flat, pixelated worlds into experiences that often feel like stepping into a movie. Designers of last year's Marvel Spider-Man 2 used the processing power of the PlayStation 5 so Peter Parker's outfits would be rendered with realistic textures and skyscraper windows could reflect rays of sunlight. That level of detail did not come cheap. Insomniac Games, which is owned by Sony, spent about $300 million to develop Spider-Man 2, according to leaked documents, more than triple the budget of the first game in the series, which was released 5 years earlier. Chasing Hollywood realism requires Hollywood budgets, and even though Spider-Man 2 sold more than 11 million copies, several members of Insomniac lost their job when Sony announced 900 layoffs in February. Cinematic games are getting so expensive and time-consuming to make that the video game industry has started to acknowledge that investing in graphics is providing diminished financial returns. It's very clear that high-fidelity visuals are only moving the needle for a vocal class of gamers in their 40s and 50s, said Jacob Navik, a former executive at Square Enix who left that studio known for the Final Fantasy series in 2016 to start his own media company. But what does my 7-year-old son play? Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite. Joost van Drunen, a market analyst and professor at New York University, said it was clear that younger generations value in their video games playing is an excuse for hanging out with other people. When millions are happy to play old games with outdated graphics, including Roblox 2006, Minecraft 2009, and Fortnite 2017, it creates challenges for studios that make blockbuster single-player titles. The industry's audience has slightly shrunk for the first time in decades. Studios are rapidly closing, and sweeping layoffs have affected more than 20,000 employees in the past 2 years, including more than 2,500 Microsoft workers. Many video game developers built their career during an era that glorified graphical fidelity. They marveled at a scene from The Last of Us Part 2 in which Ellie, the protagonist, removes a shirt over her head to reveal bruises and scrapes on her back without any technical glitches. But a few years later, costly graphical upgrades are often barely noticeable. When the studio Naughty Dog released a remastered version of The Last of Us Part 2 this year, light bounced off lakes and puddles with a more realistic shimmer. In a November ad for the PlayStation 5 Pro, an enhanced version of the Sony console that retails for almost $700, the billboards in Spider-Man 2's Manhattan featured crisper letters. Optimizing cinematic games for a narrow group of consumers who have spent hundreds of dollars on a console or computer may no longer make financial sense. Studios are increasingly prioritizing games with basic graphics that can be played on the smartphones already in everyone's pockets. They are essentially run on toasters, said Matthew Ball, an entrepreneur and video game analyst, talking about games like Roblox and League of Legends. The developers aren't chasing graphics, but the social connections that players have built over time. Developers had long taught players to equate realism with excellence, but this new toaster generation of gamers is upsetting industry orthodoxies. The developer behind Animal Well, which received extensive praise this year, said the game's file size was smaller than many of the screenshots used to promote it. A company like Nintendo was once the exception that proved the rule, telling its audiences over the past 40 years that graphics were not a priority. That strategy had shown weaknesses throughout the 1990s and 2000s, when the Nintendo 64 and GameCube had weaker visuals and sold fewer copies than Sony consoles. But now the tables have turned. Industry figures joke about how a cartoony game like Luigi's Mansion 3 on the Nintendo Switch considerably outsells gorgeous cinematic narratives on the PlayStation 5 like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. There are a number of theories why gamers have turned their backs on realism. One hypothesis is that players got tired of seeing the same artistic style in major releases. Others speculate that cinematic graphics require so much time and money to develop that gameplay suffers, leaving customers with a hollow experience. Another theory is that major studios have spent recent years reshaping themselves in Hollywood's image, pursuing crossover deals that have given audiences the Super Mario Bros. Movie and The Last of Us on HBO. Not only have companies like Ubisoft opened divisions to produce films, but their games include an astonishing amount of scenes where players watch the story unfold. In 2007, the first Assassin's Creed provided more than 2.5 hours of footage for a fan edit of the game's narrative. As the series progressed, so did Ubisoft's taste for cinema. Like many studios, it increasingly leaned on motion capture animators who would create scenes using human actors on sound stages. A fan edit of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which was released in 2020, lasted about 23 hours, longer than 2 seasons of Game of Thrones. Gamers and journalists began talking about how the franchise's entries had gotten too bloated and expensive. Ubisoft developers advertised last year's Assassin's Creed Mirage, which had about 5 hours of cut scenes, as more intimate. The immersive graphics of virtual reality can also be prohibitive for gamers. The Meta Quest Pro sells for $1,000 and the Apple Vision Pro for $3,500. This year, the chief executive of Ubisoft, Yves Guillemot, told the company's investors that because the virtual reality version of Assassin's Creed did not meet sales expectations, the company was not increasing its investment in the technology. Many studios have instead turned to the live service model, where graphics are less important than a regular drip of new content that keeps players engaged. Genshin Impact by the studio Heyoverse makes roughly $2 billion every year on mobile platforms alone, according to the data tracker Sensor Tower. It was clear this year, however, that the live service strategy carries its own risks. Warner Bros. Discovery took a $200 million loss on Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League, according to Bloomberg. Sony closed the studio behind Concord, its attempt to compete with the team-based shooters like Overwatch and Apex Legends, 1 month after the game released to a minuscule player base. We have a market that has been in growth mode for decades, Ball said. Now we are in a mature market where instead of making bets on growth, companies need to try and steal shares from each other. Some industry professionals believe there is a path forward for superb-looking games to survive the cost crunch. I used to be a high-fidelity guy. I would log into games, and if it didn't look hyper-realistic, then it was not so interesting, said David Reitman, a managing director at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he leads the consulting firm's games division. There was a race to hyper-realism, and it's tough to pivot away. You have set expectations. Reitman sees a future where most of the heavy costs associated with cutting-edge graphics are handled by artificial intelligence. He said that manufacturers are working on creating AI chips for consoles that will facilitate those changes, and that some game studios were already using smart algorithms to improve graphics further than anything previously seen. He expects that sports games will be the first genre to see considerable improvements because developers have access to hundreds of hours of game footage. They can take feeds from leagues and transpose them into graphical renderings, Reitman said, leveraging language models to generate the incremental movements and facial expressions of players. Some independent developers are less convinced. The idea that there will be content from AI before we figure out how it works and where it will source data from is really hard, said Rami Ismail, a game developer in the Netherlands. Ismail is worried that major studios are in a tight spot where traditional games have become too expensive, but live service games have become too risky. He pointed to recent games that had both jaw-dropping realism, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, Individual Pebbles of Gravel Cast Shadows, and Sensua's Saga Hellblade 2, Rays of Sunlight Flicker Through the Trees, and lackluster sales. He recalled a question that emerged early in the coronavirus pandemic and has become something of an unofficial motto of the video game industry. How can we, as an industry, make shorter games with worse graphics made with people who are paid well to work less? Ismail said. If we can, there might be short-term hope, he continued. Otherwise, I think slow strangulation of the games industry is ongoing. And there you have it, guys. That is the end of today's reading. But first and foremost, I wanted to say it's kind of funny how a handful of boomers have such a hard stranglehold on the market where they're demanding high-fidelity graphics from these companies. I've literally heard that exact sentiment from older gamers, talking about how they grew up with, quote, worse graphics, how they progressed from 8-bit, 16-bit, and 32-bit games into the ultra-photorealistic games of today, and how they see it as a step backwards for games to go back to, quote, worse graphics. It's also still just so insane to me that these developers are so completely tone-deaf. Their inability to read the room is flabbergasting. I can't decide if it's hilarious or tragic that these companies see the success of games like Minecraft and are still pitching ideas like individual shadows on gravel. Yeah, that'll make me want to play your $70 movie tie-in game, guys. More realistic dirt. Really, I just don't understand why these companies won't make the focus on, gameplay mechanics or just content. Instead of giving us peach fuzz and pimples, why aren't they giving us longer games with more engaging gameplay? I mean, God forbid we see more than 60 hours of gameplay out of a title that cost almost $100. But anyway, it's not like I want to see the death of hyper-realistic games. I just believe that there's a time and a place for them, and that if companies are resourceful enough, they will be able to create both high-fidelity games and engaging titles. The problem is, however, like the article mentioned, that many of these developers substitute high-fidelity graphics for quality of game. In my opinion, there's really only so far that the graphical fidelity of a game can carry it. What I want is more guns, more levels, more world, more enemies, more accessibility, more game mechanics. I want to be able to do more in the world that you've created, not look at rocks. That's why Minecraft has seen so much success over the years. They don't need to make the game look better because they constantly add more capabilities for the player. And instead of fighting that, these developers should just compromise. They need to find a comfortable level, get an art style that works for them, and focus on creating an engaging game. But that's going to do it for this video today, guys. Thank you so much to everybody who has stuck around up to this point and watched all of this video. I really appreciate you guys' support. And if you can, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the content I've got coming up for you in the future. And also, please hit that comment section down below with your take on today's subject. How important are graphics to you, really? And it doesn't matter where you fall on this. If you're a big fan of Roblox or if you like these super immersive, high-fidelity Final Fantasy type games, I want to hear what you got to say. I think there's a time and a place for both titles, and honestly, I can really respect a resourceful studio that's able to provide us both solid gameplay and a beautiful experience, with Metal Gear Solid 5 probably being one of my favorite examples of an amazing-looking game that's got tons of gameplay potential. That being said, guys, I've got lots more work to get done, so as always, thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, and until next time, love you guys, safe travels.